number of doctors, nurses and specialist equipment. We'll no doubt say more about that later on. And we are working around the clock to increase NHS capacity. The more people who get sick, the harder it is for the NHS to cope. We must slow the spread of the disease so that fewer people are sick at any one time. So saving lives. Stay at home to protect the NHS and save lives. The police will have powers to enforce the following restrictions: to disperse gatherings of more than 2 people in public, excluding obviously the people you live with, issuing fines for anyone who does not comply with these rules, and closing shops that are not essential, as well as prayer grounds and places of worship. Now, we are coming up to the Easter weekend, and I would implore people not to change their patterns of behaviour. Stay at home, only go out locally to exercise, and if you follow those basic rules, I'm sure we will all come through this better and quicker than we otherwise would if we ignore the rules. So thank you very much indeed. I look forward to receiving all your questions. I will do my level best to answer them, but as with the previous 2 sessions, any that I cannot give a specific answer to, I will get back to you. I will take them up with the government and get back to you. Now, the details, there are some important details now on my Facebook at Geoffrey Clifton-Brown, on my website, www.cliftonbrown.co.uk, and anybody who has a particular problem, you're more than welcome to email me direct at cliftonbrown.g, not at cliftonbrown.g, cliftonbrown.g@parliament.uk. No co's or coms, just at parliament.uk. People complain they don't get answers to their emails, but often actually they use the wrong address. So, David, with those few opening remarks, I hope I've covered 1 or 2 things that are of interest to people, and I'm more than happy to try and answer the questions that you now have.
Okay, thank you, Sir Geoffrey. I'd just like to say a few words in tribute to Frank Skinner as well, because he's a near neighbour of mine, and just to make it clear that Frank did not die of anything related to coronavirus.
Exactly.
He died of a cancer, very, very sad, but was well looked after and is indeed sorely missed by all of us who knew him and worked with him. And he was a great adversary, as you said, on occasions. I'd also like to thank, if I may, all those organisations that have streaming this particular live stream event. Not only have we got the Barn Theatre, we've got the Chamber of Commerce, who have again in Cirencester taken this on their Facebook page, your own Facebook page, which is great, and the Conservative Facebook page, and a number of other Facebook pages have promoted this, particularly Cirencester, which has a wonderful Facebook page called Cirencester Community, looking at its coping with coronavirus, which is run by Claire Wardle, and another one which is run by Dom Morris, which is the Cotswolds coping with coronavirus.
So David, question. If I may just interrupt, in answer to the question last week, will we be using social media more after this coronavirus is over? I mean, from the list of links and organisations involved in this exercise and the number of people who have actually come in online to view what is happening here, I think shows that actually we'll all be altering the way we work after this whole episode is, as you say, hopefully over.
Well, I've certainly had to, so I've learnt a lot in the last few days.
Yeah.
Right, first question from Richard Harrison. Richard Harrison, who lives in Fairford. How does the government expect to stop COVID-19 spreading to most of the population of the UK, including the most vulnerable and elderly? If it maintains guidance that it is not consistent with WHO recommendations on isolating for at least 14 days after first symptoms and tracing contacts and isolated those as well? How can the Health Service, how can the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, justify coming out of isolation after 6 to 7 days and going back into general circulation, unless he has had a test showing that he is no longer at risk of passing the virus on to others? Isn't he setting a very bad example?
Well, to answer the last part of that question first, Mr. Harrison, I think that you'll find that he probably did have 7 days isolation. I'd be very surprised if he didn't. I don't think I know, you may, I don't know the precise point at which he noticed he'd got the symptoms, and I would be very surprised if he hadn't had 7 days. Likewise, the Prime Minister, who is reportedly still displaying the symptoms, is still continuing to self-isolate when he had hoped that he would be able to join his fiancée. So the second part of your question is, of course, the government have issued some quite stringent guidelines about isolating and social distancing and everything else, which is why I've gone to such trouble in my opening remarks to try and stress to everybody that it is important that you follow those rules, and the more we follow those rules, the quicker we will defeat this invisible enemy and get back to normal life.
Thank you. The next question is, I should say that we invited people, if they wish to remain anonymous, to send their questions in, that we would respect their anonymity. But if you feel you're happy to give us your details, that makes it easier for Sir Geoffrey to be able to answer, particularly if you're sending your messages in live stream. Just having a Christian name makes it very difficult for us to follow up on those questions. By email, obviously, it's easier, but it's the live streaming. So this is from Chris, who wishes to remain anonymous. I rent my commercial property directly off the council. My rates are included in my rent, stipulated in my lease. The council do not have my business linked to this address as they own it, and when they search for rateable value, it comes up with CDC as the customer, not my business. Confirmed this on a phone call with CDC. Does this mean that the automated system that deals with cash grants of up to 25,000 will be writing a cheque to CDC instead of my company? And that's from Chris.
Well, Chris, obviously I don't know the full details of your business, and if you feel that you're not being treated correctly by the council, you are more than welcome to contact me, and I will make sure that they have the proper details. The government scheme is quite clear. Anybody who qualifies under the business rate rebate scheme will get that rebate, and anybody who qualifies will also get the grant, whether it's the 10,000 or the 25,000 grant. As regards rent, again, you should be treated exactly the same as you would be if you were renting off a commercial landlord. That is to say, you will get a 3-month holiday from that rent. It does not mean to say that you won't eventually have to repay that holiday, as with mortgage holidays and various some of the other government schemes, but you will not be worried about having to make those payments during this 3-month COVID virus episode. So if you're not getting the treatment from the council you deserve, please get back to me by email and I'll be more than happy to take it up with the council.
The next question is from Mark Weatherly. It's headed, Return to China. We have family living with us since January, the onset of the virus. They were celebrating Chinese New Year at the time and did not return to Shanghai. When can they leave this country to return to their father who works in Shanghai? They are registered in Shanghai and have UK passports. So when will there be a flight from the UK, please? I mean, it's a bit specific, but it is an interesting question looking at people who really have family who should be living abroad but find themselves trapped in this country rather than the other way around.
Well, Mike, we don't have the full details, and I think I would, on this particular question, urge you to send me an email, and I will update you when I have information. At the moment, the Chinese authorities, as you know, are not allowing people to return. That is entirely a matter for them when they do decide to allow foreign nationals to return to join their family members. But if you send me your email, I'll be more than happy to update you.
Thank you. As is in the nature of these questions, you get some that are to do with very big issues and some that are very specific. So that gives an interesting pace to this afternoon's proceedings. But this is a question from Jeremy Townsend, who we both know, based in Tetbury. It's about his garden patio. We are fortunate enough to have a large garden and a large patio in the front. Would it be possible to ask a friend round at lunchtime or later for a glass of wine or something? They would not have to go through the house and can sit at least 2 meters away. All glasses will be handled with surgical gloves and washed in the washing machine afterwards. With very best wishes for your safe health, Sir Geoffrey, from Jeremy and Sue Townsend in Tetbury.
Well, Jeremy and Sue, it would be a really enticing invitation. I well remember when I sat in your garden with a gin and tonic in hand, being entertained by you, and I'd love to be able to do it again. In fact, I will take up the invitation as soon as the government gives the all clear that it's safe to do so. But I have to be quite clear with you. The government guidelines are that we should only go out for essential needs, i.e. to buy food or medical provisions or for essential work. So at the moment, the guidance is quite clear that meeting with friends is not one of those essentials and you should not do it. and people should not come to your house. I think the idea is to keep in touch with friends online or by phone. That's perfectly in order, and be anticipating the day when you'll be able to invite them round to your wonderful garden, and I hope to be the first in that queue.
I'm getting lots of hands up, people here who'd like to be there as well. We'll all come round.
Jeremy, your stops of drink will need to be quite high.
On to more serious subjects in a minute. Another one from Jeremy, but it's an interesting one because people are getting a lot of pleasure out of their gardens because they're contained and they're protected. But at this time of year, you do want to look after your garden and enjoy it. And so Sue Townsend's asking the question, would it not be possible for garden centres to be open just like supermarkets and allowing people in 1, 2, 3 at a time? They are usually open spaces and would keep people safe, and they are really dealing often with business-to-business situations. So it's almost arguing that garden centres are quasi-essential. I'm just thinking about the livelihood and well-being of residents, which is a subject dear to your heart. This is quite an interesting question about garden centres as we move into the spring and plants growing, etc., etc. Do you have a view?
Well, Sue, another really enticing invitation to come to your garden, which is, again, well worth seeing. And I'm sorry to be a real killjoy, because the answer I'm going to give, I'm sure, again, won't satisfy you. Because of the enforced isolation at home, probably spent more continuous time in Gloucestershire than I have for many, many years. And I've had great pleasure being in my garden and watching plants and shrubs literally come out in this wonderful sunshine. But I am afraid to say that what the government is doing with its policy is trying to minimise the interaction, particularly at less than 2 metres, that any of us have. And I'm afraid inevitably, if we had garden centres open, it would mean more interaction with more people, probably at less than 2 metres, and therefore the risk of passing on the disease would be higher. There's another side to this particular coin. I've had emails from those who work in garden centres who are saying, please do not open those garden centres because we are worried about the risk to our own health having to go back to work in them. I think the people who are working in the essential shops, such as sorry about my slurring, food shops and pharmacies are doing a brave and tremendous service to the whole community by being open. They are real heroes. But I think we mustn't extend that to, if we extended it to garden centres, then other people with special interests would want their specialist shop open as well. The best advice I can give to you, Sue, I think really is that there are still many places online you can shop for all the vital garden needs, and they will be delivered. So, although, of course, the government is prioritising delivery over the emergency provisions, but nevertheless, I think it's still possible to get things delivered online, and I would urge you to do that.
Okay, thank you. This next question, I'm going to read it out. It's a one-line question, which I think you probably prefer to answer directly with the gentleman concerned. It's from Peter Sipthorpe, who says, does Sir Geoffrey regret voting for the Iraq War? I think you'd perhaps take that one offline, unless you want to say anything now.
Quite happy to do it online. Mr. Sipthorpe, if you look at my speech during the Iraq War, you will see that I was one of the very few members of Parliament that was very critical of the then Labour government for wishing to take us into war with Iraq. I voted on the main amendment against the main government amendment, but at the time, the official opposition party had a policy of cooperating with the government, as is so often the case in vital national issues, as with this coronavirus, and the opposition are largely cooperating with us. And as I was in the whip's office at the time, collective responsibility applied, and I voted with the government. But as I say, I was unhappy with it. You can go to my speech on Hansard. You'll see that I specifically mentioned that I didn't believe what was in the Tony Blair's dodgy dossier because I knew that Saddam Hussein had transferred all the weapons of mass destruction to Syria. And I said that if you weakened Iraq, you would have troubles with Iran. And my goodness, how that's come back to haunt us. So it's very easy to be wise after the event, but actually at the time, I think I was pretty prescient.
Thank you, Sir Geoffrey. And thank you for taking every question. That's why I think everyone appreciates your directness. Right, back to the subject in hand. This is from Robin Levin. I always get these tricky surnames,
Yes.
but you always get to call them by their Christian name. So, Robin Levin. Will the government, as part of the relaxing of controls process, recommend that all retailers implement a no-contact click-and-collect system? Grocery stores could call this drive-through groceries. This will be much more efficient than deliveries because it is much less resource-intensive. It will enable the elderly who are not infirm to obtain goods currently denied to them by not being able to get delivery slots. It will also keep them away from the inevitable reinfection risk. And that's from Robin Levin.
Well, Robin, your question raises a very big issue. How are we going to get back to normal out of this terrible national emergency, this crisis, the invisible enemy? And I think you're quite right that we're going to have to be vigilant for quite some considerable time, at least probably until a vaccine is developed, to make sure that we don't see a mass return of it. And therefore, we will need to think very carefully about all of our shopping habits. In fact, any sort of habit where we are mixing with large numbers of other people. And one obvious way is click and collect. And I imagine that the major retailers, the major supermarkets, and indeed garden centres and others, where there are large numbers of people coming to one particular site, will want to think about their methods of dealing with the customer. And I would have thought click and collect was one of those. But I think what we'll have to do is watch the government guidelines as we get through this whole episode and as we come out of it. And the government will need to give us some guidance of how to deal with all of this.
Thank you, Sir Geoffrey. I'm just having a little bit of a technology problem here, so you have to bear with me.
So, well, perhaps a few remarks.
Here it is.
Oh,
okay.
right.
Thank
Okay.
you. You can save me a bit later on, because I'm sure it's going to happen again.
I was going to address more of that question, how we get out of this, which is
right,
a
would
really
you like
important
to?
subject.
Go ahead.
No, for another day.
This is a slightly difficult one, which you and I have spoken about. This is to do with tenants' business support from Cotswold District Council. And we heard Councillor Harris speak last week, this week rather, very eloquently about support for the residents and businesses in the Cotswolds, and I'd like to congratulate him and his team for the job that they're doing alongside you. But this is an interesting question. The gentleman's preferring to remain anonymous, but I do think we should read it out. I've been sent a copy of a blanket letter from Cotswold District Council to a commercial tenant who has requested a freeze in their rent. The response is self-explanatory. The council is offering to defer commercial rents for 3 months rather than offer a rent-free period. This runs counter to the majority of private landlords who are doing all they can to help their tenants. What this effectively means is that a business, if it is lucky to restart once the coronavirus is over, will be hit with a deferred rent payment just at the time when they are trying to get their business back on its feet. The letter runs counter to the expressions of support I've heard from Councillor Harris on the CDC's live stream. I don't think it does. I just think it's something that is the issue that we discussed about elected representatives expressing a view and then officers having to follow that up. It applies to government as well as locally. But what he's asking is, will you take that up with CDC?
I will happily take it up with CDC. I gave an answer earlier on, which I think is that most commercial landlords are being asked by the government to give a 3-month rent holiday, but would then expect that that rent would be repaid afterwards. But I, again, would have thought that both commercial landlords and indeed the council, and this is what I will be taking up with them, in asking for that rent holiday money to be repaid, would not expect it all to be repaid in one lump. There would be a period of time over which payments could be made, because obviously people will then have to get back to paying their full rent anyway. So I will, of course, I do have regular conference calls with senior officers and senior councillors of the District Council. I will happily take this up. I do email them on a fairly regular basis about various problems for which they're responsible for, and I'll happily take this one up.
Thank you. Bear with me with the computer.
This rents problem is a real problem both for landlords, both in the commercial sector and the private sector, because many landlords, of course, have their own obligations to meet, mortgages or bank loans or whatever. And if their tenants don't pay, it could put them in financial difficulties. So I think that we're going to have to really think hard how we deal with this whole rental issue, especially if it comes to the point where the coronavirus goes on, God forbid, longer than the government is currently estimating, and some of these schemes have to be extended.
Okay, thank you. Next question is from Dan Newman-Turner. And Dan's asking a question headed, why are those who are incorporated and paying themselves minimum PAYE and dividends left out of the government support scheme? Small business directors have also lost all of their income, just the same as the employed and self-employed. We should receive the same level of support, as we will also face higher taxes to pay for all of this when it's over. Thank you. Dan Newman-Turner.
So, Dan, we had a little bit of discussion about dividends last week. It has now become clearer that a number of businesses, quite a large number of businesses, trade as limited companies, small limited companies, and are not covered by the various schemes. As you can imagine, the government is listening very hard to those that fall between the cracks. We will certainly take up every single query we get on this. And I don't know, but I suspect the government may well wish to modify their schemes in future. To give you a technical, though you and others like you, on dividends, as I did last week, the issue is twofold, really. The first issue is one of fraud. On a tax return, dividends are entered as one aggregate amount, and therefore the government, the HMRC, have no way of knowing whether it's a dividend from your own company or a dividend from any other number of companies in which you've invested. So that's point one, why the government have been a bit hesitant about dividends. Point two is those people have deliberately taken advice, perfectly legally, perfectly acceptably, to how to minimize the tax that they pay. One way they can reduce the tax a bit is by paying themselves part wages and part dividends. But of course, under this scheme, they've now found that that's to their disadvantage. But having paid less tax in the past, this is the government's reasoning, they should not now benefit from this scheme. But again, I'm sure the government are listening. I don't know whether they will modify the scheme for dividends. I simply have no idea.
I've been contacted in this same vein, and I gather there's an online petition with 200,000 signatures on it. So it is a big issue. And as people have said before about the new Chancellor, he's doing, we all think, a fantastic job. But he's having to make policy on the hoof. He's never had to do this before. It's completely new ground. And obviously these things are coming to light, which is why I think these sessions are so important, because we're getting questions that are reoccurring, but they're changing as the weeks go through. I look back at the questions that we had 2 weeks ago, and they're very different now to the questions that we're getting today.
And the government has responded. I mean, today's announcement by the Chancellor on the COVID virus interruption loan scheme, that you don't now have to prove that you can't borrow the money on commercial terms. You are not expected to put surety of your own home against the loan, should, I think, enable more people easier to get these loans. But the only thing I would say to the people, and there are still a lot of people out there, because we're having emails on this subject, who are having difficulties from their banks, please contact me in every case, and I'd be more than happy to take it up. But I have found that a couple of people who are particularly persistent did manage to find at the beginning of this week, they did manage to get an interruption loan. So I think the message to all of you who are finding difficulties with their banks, be persistent. If, having been persistent, you are still not receiving satisfaction, then email me and I will take it up on your behalf.
One of the questions that we are going to get later, but it's on that subject, if I might just add to what you said, Sir Geoffrey, is this whole issue of the banks, because a lot of the banks have their back office staff in India, and where they have as big a problem, if not bigger, when it comes to coronavirus. And I know that Barclays had to send all their back office staff home, but the trouble was they couldn't home work because they didn't have computers. So the story goes that they've actually issued them with laptops, but they actually have no connectivity. whereas NatWest appears to be the only bank that's actually, and I'm not here promoting NatWest, they appear to have a lot of their resource in Europe, whereas a lot of the other banks are having to really think again about what they're doing, because a lot of their back end is in the Far East and in India, and it is a real problem. Chasing profits at a time when we're really struggling to deal with this may need us to reassess an awful lot of things in our lives.
That is why it's important that you email me. I bank with Barclays, and I am struggling with them a bit at the moment, so that I can begin to get a pattern of whether it's the design of the scheme in general, or whether, as you say, David, it's a particular bank, because the two that got their loans were not from Barclays. So I don't know whether there's a problem out there.
I'm certainly not skilled talking about banks. I'm just passing on the observation from a local businessman. Right, this question is from Virginia Stoughton, who's a great supporter of the Barn and a good friend. She's saying, firstly, wishing all those affected parliamentarians a speedy recovery. Well, that's lovely. Thank you, Virginia. Clearly, for good reasons, Brexit has gone off the map. I thought someone would ask us a question about that. Nonetheless, some information would be welcome. Have negotiations stopped, and therefore the deadlines no longer exist? Are negotiations proceeding, and is there a no deal still a possibility? Because air travel is likely to take years to recover, and air pollution will have lessened, making reaching wider markets less viable, is there a possibility Brexit will be reviewed?
Right.
Tricky question.
Well, Virginia, may I reciprocate your good wishes and hope that you and your family keep safe as well. On Brexit, and thank you also for your support to the Barnes Theatre. It's another opportunity for me to give them a plug. They are a fantastic community asset. I'm in touch with the Arts Council to try and see if we can find them a bit of extra funding. But any funding they can get from their friends around anywhere in the UK would be very welcome. So I'm really pleased that you're a friend of the theatre, as am I, and I think they do a fantastic job. On Brexit, right. I read reports in the newspapers that the two principal negotiators, namely Monsieur Barnier and David Frost on behalf of the government, have been both self-isolating, which is why the last scheduled high-level meeting between them didn't take place. That does not mean to say that work is not still continuing behind the scenes, particularly online. It is. Whether it will be able to be completed by the 31st of December, I do not know. I am not sufficiently close to those negotiations. But I wouldn't be surprised, and there are possibilities, that that date could be deferred, in which case, obviously, the Prime Minister would have to come back to Parliament and seek a small amendment to the bill. But given the scale and the disruption that this coronavirus has caused to, the whole of Europe, but the whole world, I wouldn't be surprised if those negotiations were postponed, or the deadline were postponed. As regards to whether it'll be reversed, I think that is highly, highly unlikely. This country has spent billions and billions of pounds preparing for that exit. We've now passed the Acts of Parliament we have left. We're in the transition period. I think it is very, very unlikely that the whole thing will be reversed. I'm sorry, that's probably not what you want to hear.
But it is interesting that people are still concerned about Brexit when our whole focus is on coronavirus.
And they are right to be concerned about Brexit. And if we hadn't had the coronavirus and we'd had this session today, I suspect most of it would have been taken up by Brexit. Firms and individuals worried about what the future would hold for them in terms of tariffs and trade and all sorts of things. So it's not gone away. It's still a big problem that this country needs to face and resolve.
But also, it's something you said when you set up these live sessions with the Barn Theatre and Ewan and Richard, which was your desire to want to continue to have these sessions because it gives you an opportunity to really get in contact with people using social media. But as we move through coronavirus into restarting our economy, looking again at Brexit, we've got a mountain to climb.
We have.
Haven't we?
We have.
And
the last thing we want to do, really, is to, having had one crisis for business, then put them into another difficulty with Brexit negotiations. So I think that there's a lot of thinking needs to go on. This economy, as indeed most economies around the world, will suffer enormously. And everybody will need to think how we get the whole economy moving again. And they'll need to think how that interacts with the Brexit negotiations. So, Virginia, you raised a really interesting point.
Okay. The next question is from Elizabeth White in Loughborough. And her question is to do with the testing kits. We are hearing a lot about the lack of testing kits from NHS staff and those in the front line. What is the truth of this, and why has some forward thinking not been applied to this issue? I read in today's paper that one UK company has been exporting testing kits to 80 countries, including India. Where has the planning gone so badly wrong for this vital equipment? Is that true, that a UK company's been exporting when we need the kits here?
I am not aware of that, David, but I'm very happy to look into it. I am not aware of that. So let's just talk about PPE, protective clothing and ventilators. And the first thing to say about all this, it's very easy to be critical of the government and the NHS, perhaps seeming to be rather slow at all of this. But as the Australians found with a huge shipment of PPE from China, it's reported anyway, when it came in, it was found not to be effective. Now, we've had huge numbers of offers for all of this kit from all around the place, but the government has to check out each offer, A, that it's effective, that it works, that it's not going to fall apart, and that it's cost effective. So that process has been going on. And what I wanted to do, if I could find it fairly quickly, was to read you out from the rolling brief, if I can find it fairly quickly, what exactly is going on. So my brief tells me, working with British manufacturers to support the production of essential medical equipment for the NHS, such as ventilators. Well, ventilators, there are 8,000 ventilators available and another 8,000 expected shortly. Testing, we increased the amount of testing. The Health Secretary promised that we would have 10,000 tests a day by the end of March. We met that. He then promised that we would have 25,000 by the middle of April. And he's now extended that in the last day or so to 100,000 by the end of April. I'm just hoping he hasn't made a huge rod for his own back, and we actually do meet those targets, because they are some fairly big numbers. Not to say that others haven't met those numbers, so we should be able to. And then I was just trying to find you were asking about PPE. Yes, here we are. On the 23rd of March 2020, we announced, this is the government, that we were ramping up the delivery of personal protective equipment for NHS staff fighting coronavirus. In the face of this unprecedented global emergency, never has the need been to bolster our workers and arm them with the tools they need be more critical. So, distribution of more pieces of equipment to the NHS staff so that everybody who needs physical protective equipment can get it. We've established the National Supply Distribution Response Team, supported by the Armed Forces, to deliver equipment to people who need it most. We've delivered 170 million FFP3 masks, surgical masks and other PPE equipment, 23 million surgical masks, 42.8 million gloves, 13.7 million aprons, 182,000 gowns, almost 10 million items of cleaning equipment, and 2.3 pairs of eye protectors. But I do accept that, particularly here in Gloucestershire, as you know, I have a conference call with all the NHS chiefs every Friday. We will be having another one tomorrow. I am well aware that in Gloucestershire, and not only have our frontline health staff been desperately short of this PPE equipment, but also their sister organisations, those working in social care, the care home sector, and so on. And this is not acceptable. And we as 6 Gloucestershire MPs work very closely together. We're in touch with each other on a daily basis. And 2 of us have personally spoken to Matt Hancock about this, stressed the absolute need to sort it out in Gloucestershire. and we will be getting an update tomorrow to hear what the situation is. But I do accept the situation in Gloucestershire has been far from optimal.
Thank you. This question is from Anthony Royal, Director of Broadlands Guest House. It's quite a long question. We are directors of a newly created business in Bourton-on-the-Water, who are desperate to survive, having taken over a B&B business 15 months ago. We are fearful that this crisis will be terminal for our business and for ourselves, with no income foreseeable for the remainder of this year. We've been avidly following all the pronouncements of the Chancellor and the government and trying to ensure the survival of our business. When we eventually emerge from the coronavirus crisis, there seems to be a gap which the owners of businesses like ours fall into. There is help for employees with the 80% support grant, and there is support of a similar nature for self-employed too, in addition to some support for the business, for which the government is to be greatly commended. However, owners of businesses like ourselves rely on dividends. This is something that's come up frequently, I know, from their profitable companies, which this year will be non-existent. Many businesses like ours may not survive this year, even with the support packages announced. So some owners may become bankrupt, and any personal investment savings will have to be taking a huge hit on the stock market with up to 30% crash. We directors with no personal income from the business will experience real hardship. Can you please lobby the Chancellor on our behalf as to how the individual directors of small companies could be supported from bankruptcy and destitution, particularly when there is no income for a long period, which could last for the rest of the year? And that's from Anthony Royal.
Well, Anthony, as a businessman myself, I absolutely understand what you're going through. The government is getting from every member of Parliament lobbying about dividends and small limited companies. I'm sure they're listening, and that is the purpose. One of the purposes of why this session is so important, so that we can hear from people on the ground like you where there are problems, feed these through to the Chancellor, and he will then have to make the decision whether he can widen the existing schemes. So thank you very much for raising that with me. You have my absolute assurance that that will be fed, as all the other queries will be fed through to the Chancellor.
There was a question that I received that's gone to you personally, and now's a good time as we switch to the live stream to ask the question, which is about the grants that the taxable allowable elements that people are allowed to give to their children of £3,000 tax-free, and the suggestion that perhaps that could be increased at this time, because there are people out there who are retired, who effectively are, I wouldn't say well placed, but have managing their retirement. This obviously is a kid, but they would like to help their children and their grandchildren, and some consideration could be given to reviewing the tax situation when it comes to giving gifts, financial gifts to your children. Could you take that away and give that some thought?
I will certainly take it away. The danger is that this whole coronavirus scenario gives rise to every sort of request for giveaways from the Chancellor. He is going to have one almighty task at the end of this coronavirus to get the economy back on course and somehow look after all the borrowing that he will inevitably incur as a result of it. So not every request can be made. But I've noted what you've said. I will pass it on. I'm not an accountant, but I would look at donations out of regular income. Ask, if you don't know what I'm talking about, ask your accountant. There may be some salvation there.
Okay, thank you. We're now on the live stream using a bit of new technology, so if I miss a beat, please bear with me. Brendan Comby says, why was there not more preparation made following exercise Cygnus in 2016?
Well,
people might want to know what exercise Cygnus
was the role-playing scenario of precisely this, a major pandemic. And a number of things arose from that. And it is fair to say that one of the things that arose was the need for an adequate vaccine, was the need for sufficient protective clothing, and both things as yet are not optimal. So clearly, the problem with a national emergency, and one can think of a few scenarios which these planning exercises are supposed to deal with, you never know quite which one's going to hit you and when it's going to hit you, and you don't want to spend an enormous amount of government money protecting from every potential national emergency. The only thing I would say is, and I do absolutely admit that the number of tests, the PPE, the number of ventilators is at the moment not optimal. But if you look in the Times report today and look at the graph of the number of cases in the UK is tracking almost exactly those of Germany, who is supposed to have ramped up all these tests and everything else much better than we have. So whilst I hope that we can get over this thing as quickly as possible, and the government is listening very carefully, which is why the Health Secretary has made the pledges that he has about the 100,000 tests, that we can get the tests, the PPE, the ventilators up as quickly as possible to get on top of this disease and get out of the self-isolating regime that we're in at the moment.
Thank you for that. From Rich Brazier, why have the high-risk category of people not had a letter yet?
I don't know is the answer, and I wasn't aware that they hadn't not been in one of the high-risk categories. I'm afraid I simply wasn't aware that they haven't. I will chase that up, and we will put an answer online as to what the situation is.
That would be great. Thank you.
It shows we are really live and that we haven't prepared the questions, because I wasn't prepared for that question.
We certainly are live. I think the other thing about this live streaming, which I know that Joe also agreed with, is it's the opportunity when people see you answering questions, it does act as a springboard for them to think about future questions or to come back on a question that they may have asked before. And so that's far more interactive than just them emailing you, to have this opportunity to talk to you. And I know it's live because I'm up here with you. Right. A bit of a criticism on your response to the Matt Hancock question here from Richard Harrison, and who asked the question, and Susan Appleby. He said that really what Matt Hancock should have done is self-isolate for 14 days, not 7. And Susan Appleby says he didn't answer the question, why not 14 days and why not tested before mixing with others? That was the question. But really, perhaps it's for Matt Hancock to take that question
it is
rather
really,
than you.
It is absolutely that.
Because I was surprised as well.
Yeah. I'm sure that you won't be the only person making that criticism.
Okay. This is a question from Neil Holt. The Chancellor has put in place a groundbreaking set of measures to help real people through the current crisis. Nobody knows how that will be paid for, but the government could now make an immediate dent in these costs by cancelling some capital projects such as HS2. So we've had Brexit, now we've got HS2, and this is a really important point. We've got money allocated for huge projects nationally and also locally, I might add. It was always a folly that would benefit relatively few people. By using HS2 budget and possibly that of other major capital projects to benefit all people in the UK, this government can demonstrate that it really does have the interests of the wider population at heart, rather than running in fear of contractual disputes with major international contractors who have shown themselves incapable of managing their contracts to time and cost. I should point out Neil Holt was in the construction industry, so he does know what he's talking about. Not that I would suggest he didn't, but would you like to take a view on HS2 and other huge capital projects?
So the Prime Minister during the general election and the Chancellor in the budget made the point that if we wish to grow our economy and compete internationally, we need to have superb infrastructure. And it isn't just railways, it's things like broadband and roads as well. Now, we could stop all that expenditure and we could become less productive and less competitive internationally. But I think what we really should be striving to do is to come out of this whole coronavirus, work out how we're going to pay for everything. But at the same time, international loan rates are pretty low. and the point was made during the general election and during the budget, that now is a good time to invest in our country to make us internationally competitive. And on HS2, you may be aware, but if you're not, I will tell you, I spent over a year on the committee on HS2. I started that year being opposed to it. I ended up being in favour of it, and let me tell you why. The East Coast Main Line, railway line, and certainly the West Coast railway line, certainly at peak times, but at a lot of other times as well, is completely full. And unless we get people out of our cars, our car journey times on many of our major roads are simply going to become unacceptable. Many of them for many hours of the day, as is the case of the M6 round Birmingham, will simply come to a standstill. And therefore, I think we do need to increase our rail network. We do need to take some capacity off both the East Coast and West Coast Main Line so that we can get more freight up from HGVs off our roads and onto rail. These things are environmentally friendly. It's something we should be doing. And as regards to battling with international construction firms, that is the case with any major infrastructure. And I'm afraid it's up to those experts that the government hires to make sure they manage those contracts properly. And there are plenty of people in this country with expertise to do that. So I know HS2 is expensive, but as with the case in many of our major competitors, particularly, for example, the Chinese and the Japanese, they have invested a great deal of money in high-speed rail to increase their capacity, and I'm sure that that's what we ought to be doing ourselves. But at the same time, as a member of the Public Accounts Committee, I entirely agree with you. We do need to bear down very heavily on the costs of that project. It's already risen alarmingly, I think probably because it wasn't properly scoped in the first place. But we now need to make sure that we control those costs very carefully indeed.
Okay. Still got plenty more questions, Sir Geoffrey, and I'm actually moving between the laptop and a mobile phone because questions are coming in on both. But just to remind people, if I may, that you can not only send your questions in live streaming on Facebook, but also you can email them in on contact@cotswoldspeaks.co.uk, which is an email address that Sir Geoffrey set up specifically for this purpose. contact@cotswold speaks.co.uk. And if we don't answer it today, we'll answer it next week.
So, David, I admire your dexterity at being able to handle all this technology. I'm absolutely certain when all this is over, you will be able to take the place of one of the major BBC presenters and earn a terrific salary.
Well, praise indeed from you. Message from Michelle Milner. She says you can get seeds online and plants online.
Good.
And she should know, she's an estate agent.
Yes.
So,
good. There you are.
And I hope you're...
Jeremy, Sue, you can get seeds online. I'm sure you can get other things online too that you will need for your garden.
Okay, right. Another serious question from Susan Appleby. My daughter has moved out of her university shared accommodation. Her rent is due. Should she still pay this from her loan? Interesting point, this. Her university loan. Who will pay her rent when she resumes her placement, as this is her final year and she should have graduated by mid-June? My advice has been given, no advice has been given from her university, so can her MP give us some advice?
Yes. We've had one or two emails along similar lines. If you would be kind enough to email me at cliftonbrown@parliament.uk with your precise details of where your daughter, I think it was at university, I will take that up directly with the Chancellor of that university. I think the whole thrust of the government's programme during the coronavirus is that people shouldn't be worried about their finances, least of all young university students. And I think the universities should be giving their students a rent holiday whilst they're not able to be at university. So I will happily take it up with the university, and if that doesn't work, I'll take it up with the government. So please email me with your details.
I think it's worth restating, Sir Geoffrey, that this whole idea did start with people saying they couldn't get hold of the Chancellor or indeed the Secretary of State for Health, but they knew that by talking to you, you could. So you've punctuated a number of these responses by saying that you have spoken directly to the relevant minister. And I think, although no one would wish the coronavirus on anybody, the opportunity to have you, standing there helping us, doing the job that an MP should do, and I'm sure that's being replicated across Gloucestershire, is fantastic. And I know that from the people I've spoken to, that people do appreciate that.
That is why I like our parliamentary system, David. We have to go into that parliamentary lobby to vote several times every week, and everybody from the Prime Minister downwards is in that lobby. So it is an opportunity to corner any minister from the Prime Minister downwards on an individual problem and ask them what they're going to do about it. And
Whereas I can't do that.
And you can't do that, and it is much more effective where somebody can do it face to face. We're not able to do that at the moment, but they know very well, all of those ministers, because I'm a long-standing member of Parliament, that I shall be after them after this whole thing is over if they haven't at least given me a response.
Okay, thank you. Right. Andy Harris, are you looking into the email that I have sent through your website about relaxing the refunds on holidays abroad? Most people cannot afford to lose the sort of money they would if their flights go ahead, yet they don't deem it safe to do so. So if I go with the other members of my booking as my flights are still scheduled, the UK just getting through and on a plane of 200 other people come back infected because they cannot afford not to go. So the issue is people who can't afford to give up their holidays. I'm not aware of people going on holiday at all at the moment.
I think that we must say very clearly in the first instance, you must not go on holiday until the government guidelines make it clear that it's safe to do so. As you say, the idea of sitting on a plane with 200 other people until it is safe to do so is not sensible at all. As regards to refunds, I think we've got to, what will probably happen is that most travel companies will offer you a postponement of your holiday. It can be taken when the coronavirus is over, and I would have thought that that makes eminent sense.
Okay, good advice. This is from Chris, who's choosing to remain anonymous on this one. Would the government consider reducing tax due on private pension scheme withdrawals? It may make the difference for a lot of people that need emergency cash.
Well, again, if you will email me with the details, I will pass this on to the Chancellor. I think it's an interesting one. It's one that I'd not heard of before. I wasn't prepared for the question, but I think that it is something that the Treasury ought to at least look at to see whether it makes sense.
Okay. Question from, well, it's not a question, it's from Alice Story, who is saying that she emailed a question yesterday for today and is not sure if it was meant for this particular forum. It may well be that we come to your question, Alice, but could I suggest that you resend the question now? I've been told to move faster through the questions. I thought I was going really fast.
Well, I thought I was giving quite brief answers.
Yeah, you were. Okay, I'll move faster. Thank you very much. Right. But Alice, do resend the question.
It's the sort of thing that the...
Maybe that job at the BBC is not on offer.
Well, I think he would get a message in his ear.
Oh, would he? Okay. I think I might get a message somewhere else, given my colleagues here at the Barn Theatre. Right. Kay Ransom, I've spoken to the local Universal Credit team this week. They have confirmed that as a sole trader I have been accepted onto the UC scheme. The one caveat she mentioned is she said that they had no idea if the self-employed who receive Universal Credit will have to pay all or a portion of it back when we receive our grant. Do you have an idea of the truth behind this? And that's from Kay Ransom, who's a local photographer.
Well, first thing is, Kay, you've asked the question before. I am delighted that you have been accepted onto the scheme, because at least that means you're going to get some weekly income. So that is really good news. As to the question of whether it's going to have to be paid back, I think that depends on what you eventually manage to end up receiving from the self-employed scheme. Can I take that away? As you've asked the question, we must have your email address. I make a note and I'll come back to you.
I've just had a message from Alice who says she's forwarded the question now. So this is really going to put me on my mettle.
Absolutely.
See if I can find this question.
Absolutely.
If not, I'm going to make it my life's work for the weekend to find it. Thanks for that question, Kay. A question from Jan Smith, who asked you a question last week. We've unfortunately not had a response from yourselves after we sent our details over on Messenger. We'll have to double-check Messenger, Jan.
Who was that?
I do apologise. Jan Schmidt. SMIDT.
I remember the question.
Do you remember the question? It was
Jan.
about rates. Do you remember? Do you want me to restate it?
Yes,
It's here.
please do.
The company was Cotswold Hose and Fittings. Question was, what help is available for companies that fall in the businesses with property with a rateable value between £15,000 and £51,000, but are not in the retail, hospitality and leisure sectors, according to CDC? We have been told that we are not eligible for the 10,000 to 25,000 category by CDC, and that's from Cotswold Hose and Fittings. I'm
Right.
sure you dealt with that, but...
No, I recognise the name, Jan, and if you would email me directly, that would be tremendous help on cliftonbrown@parliament.uk, and then we will take it up.
Okay. Question again from Richard Harrison, or more of a statement. UK abandoned isolation and contact tracing very early when community transmission started, worse in London. Why is this not still being pursued in other areas of the country, such as the Cotswolds, where this might still be effective? Isn't this how China contained the outbreak mostly in Hubei province?
Well, as far as I'm aware, Richard, tracing is still going on. And there are bits in the newspapers today about how surveys are being carried out amongst populations so that the government can trace the trend of how the cases are going. So I don't think that it has been stopped. So I'm not quite sure of the premise of your question.
Right. Alice's question has come through.
Brilliant.
Right.
The technology works.
Not technology as we know it. It's on my mobile phone. Okay. Right. Hi, John. Thank you for chairing these very useful sessions. Please, could you forward my next question to Sir Geoffrey for today's forum? Dear Sir Geoffrey, I wrote to you in the last Q&A and you advised waiting for the self-employed support measures to be announced, which I have done. The issues we have remain, however. We, and many like us, will need more help if we are simply to survive. As a small limited company, we are remunerated for our work through a mixture of salary and dividends. The reason for this is because as a small ethical marketing agency, our work fluctuates from month to month. And we have no longer got payment cycle. We have longer payment cycles, and so we might experience a month or more with little or no revenue. So to allow for these leaner months, we draw a lower monthly salary under the PAYE system to cover the months without any revenue coming into the business, and supplement our annual income with dividends when the business trades more effectively, on which we pay corporation tax. Rishi Sunak said, if we all want to benefit equally from state support, we must all pay equally in the future. As a small limited company, we are paying our taxes. Only ours come in the form of corporation tax. We have to operate as a limited company because the clients we work for dictate this to be the case, and we pay the maximum PAYE that our cash flow will allow. We are operating both legally and with ethical values at our core. That's the nature of their business, as she said at the beginning. But under current arrangements, as the owners of small businesses who are covering our own start-up costs, generating our own work and employment, and taking all the financial risk, we would receive a grant based solely upon our PAYE contributions and not our dividends. And this is in capitals and in bold. Therefore, would the government please help us save our business with the same level of support that they have promised to other small businesses by offering a grant for the dividend element of our income in proportion with the corporation tax rate we pay on it? We are desperately exploring other avenues, our options to maintain liquidity, but obtaining a business interruption loan is proving to be a minefield, and without business premises and no option to trade whilst we furlough the director's PAYE salary element, we are likely to be accepted. As the Prime Minister has said on a number of occasions, small businesses like ours, in the tens of thousands or the thousands of thousands, are the engines of the British economy, and no more so than in the Cotswolds. Now we are ready and waiting in the wings to aid Britain's economic current. Now we want to be here to be able to do that. But for now, we need help. Please place our small limited company and thousands like us on a level of parity with other small businesses. That's a real cry for help, Sir Geoffrey.
So, Alice, this is a fantastic question, because you may just have unlocked the door. the fact that you and others like you are required by your clients to trade as a limited company, I think really suggests to the government that they ought to be sympathetically looking at those who are trading in limited companies. And I will put your case as strongly as I can to the Chancellor. And hopefully, because it's on David's phone, we have your details online.
We do. My phone has nothing else on it but these questions. This is a question from Joan Mahala Plata. I hope I've expressed your surname correctly, Joan. So Joan Mahala Plata, and this is question number 1. As it is suggested that this virus originated from the wet markets in China, where many different species of live animals, creatures, some caught from the wild, are held in close proximity, being brought for human consumption. Due to this close proximity, it gave the chance of this virus, COVID-19, to spread from the live animals to humans. This has resulted in a pandemic where many people have and will lose their lives. What can our government do to end this practice so as to safeguard our lives and the world economies in the future? I should say that Joan is a registered nurse, so she knows what she's talking about. So the question is, what can the government do to end this practice, so to safeguard our lives and world economies in the future? And then I'll come on to question 2.
So, Joan, I think you can be absolutely assured that the Chinese economy, having suffered so drastically and with so many deaths and with so much opprobrium being heaped upon China as the originator of this disease, that they will be looking at all their procedures very carefully indeed. I assume that you're an animal lover, a pet lover, a dog lover, and to those of us who are animal lovers, the idea of eating some of these domestic animals is completely abhorrent. Whenever my fiancée tries to show me this online, I simply won't look at it because I find it so distasteful. So I think you can rest assured that there will be international pressure on the Chinese, but they will themselves want to examine this whole thing as well.
Okay, question 2. As a retired nurse, my heart goes out to the dedicated NHS staff. Yesterday evening on the telly, someone suggested the government should give compensations to the families of the NHS staff who lose loved ones from COVID-19, and that was that really sad story of someone who has died in their 50s. It is suggested that NHS staff are dying due to lack of protective equipment. This is appalling. Why are we losing NHS staff in this way? Industry, it's reported, offered over 2 weeks ago to help make items to increase safety. Can you tell me why it is taking so long to get them on board? Why were we not better prepared? And this is something we've heard earlier today, you know, our preparedness. And would you like to comment on that?
Well, we have talked about this quite a lot. I think one of the answers is that it's no good buying equipment that isn't effective. You've got to check it out. It's got to be effective. But I agree with you. Our frontline workers deserve every possible protection that we can give them. And that is why I read out the sort of delivery that is taking place. I still don't think it's enough. And I am pressing the government as hard as I can to make sure that this is all rolled out as quickly as possible. But I do take this opportunity to thank all of those NHS workers that are operating on the front line. Even at the best of times, it's a very difficult, often harrowing job. At this time, it's even more so. So you deserve all of our thanks very much. But more than our thanks, you deserve the government to try and support you with the equipment that you need. And that is why I'm pressurising them to do so.
This is a question about the armed forces, another essential group within our community. It's from Rosemary Andrews. Why are there pictures of our brave armed forces helping to set up Nightingale hospitals and the transportation of emergency supplies, but without them practicing social distancing or seeming to have any form of protective clothing, not even gloves on their hands? Surely this sends out the wrong message to young, fit people that the rules are for the older generation, not just for them. And that's from Rosemary. That's a good point that she's making.
Yeah, it is a very good point. I think that the Army have done a fantastic job, both at getting the Nightingale Hospital built in record quick time. The Chinese boasted how quickly they could build new hospitals, but it seems to me that our superb armed forces are able to do the job just as well. And they've done it not only at the Nightingale Hospital in London, they've done it in Manchester, they've done it in Birmingham, and we are going to have a facility in Bristol as well, so that if our hospitals get full, we were able to transfer patients to Bristol. So I think our armed forces have done a fantastic job. Clearly, there will be people responsible for that project who will have looked at the risks involved, looked at the practicality of social distancing and wearing gloves. I don't know why those decisions were taken. All I can do is be hugely thankful that those hospitals have been built. I think they should be a great reassurance to all of us that there will be enormously increased capacity in the NHS. I think our armed forces, in every respect, when there is a crisis, do a fantastic job. We've got 3 military planners helping us with emergency preparations in Gloucestershire, and I gather they've been a huge help. So I say to them, thank you for coming to Gloucestershire, and thank you for helping with our emergency planning.
And thank you for that. And a question here from the owners of the Horse and Groom in Oddington, Warren Turner, the director, sorry. I'm a director and landlord at the Horse and Groom Inn in Upper Oddington near Stow-on-the-Wold. The pub has 11 staff on its payroll. On Friday the 20th of March, in response to government instructions, we closed the pub to the public. We have since been providing a limited takeaway service, but this is so far generating less than 10% on the revenue received prior to closure. We have been promised government support, and this is welcome. However, in a business as dependent as ours is on cash flow, we are at a crossroads. Whilst we have furloughed our staff, we don't have enough cash to pay them whilst we wait for the HMRC systems to catch up and repay us their 80% salaries. We have applied to our bank under the Business Interruption Loan Scheme, applying on the day the scheme went live, but we have heard nothing. We have applied to Cotswold District Council for the £25,000 grant, but hear from them today that they won't begin payments until at least the 13th of April. Today our bank balance is already over our agreed overdraft limit, and we have no cash to continue. We cannot continue to pay our staff or suppliers. We are doing what we can to keep our small community supported, but feel that we are now battling against the odds to do so. The financial support needs to be available much quicker, or we will have no choice other than to let our staff go and board up the pub. So my question is, what can be done to speed up the support available, both from the banks and from the District Council, to ensure that we have some cash immediately so that we can stand at least a small chance of keeping going? Many thanks, from Warren Turner.
Well, Warren, there are a few things that you and I can do. The first thing to do is that I will take this up with the District Council. Whether there was reports of District Councils not having the right software to deal with this emergency loan package that each of them being given by the government. I don't know whether that's been resolved or whether it hasn't. I will take that up with the District Council in short order. As I've advised other people trying to get the interruption loan, is to keep pestering your bank. And if that all doesn't work, email me rapidly who your bank is, and I will see what I can do.
Thank you. Next question is from Rosemary McGruther, and she asked a question last week, so she's coming back to us. I'm writing to inquire if Sir Geoffrey has received any responses from ministers regarding the questions from last week's live stream about whether directors can furlough themselves and remain on furlough even though they continue to do work such as administrative tasks, such as maintaining, do you remember that question, where she was maintaining her website and things like that, just to keep the business, this issue of the business ticking over, not working as such, but just to get it ready for the future. One issue that has arisen for me this week is that the government's allowing businesses to defer VAT payments. In order to do this, I need to contact my bank to remove an automatic direct debit. I now appear to have a choice between staying on furlough and paying my VAT, or stopping the VAT payment but coming off furlough and paying my salary instead. I note that the Self-Employed Income Support Scheme does not have any restrictions on self-employed business owners continuing to work. If this lack of restriction is meant to apply to directors as well, it would be really helpful if the HMRC website guidance on the coronavirus job retention scheme could be updated. Thanks for looking into this, and that's from Rosemary, Britain Express Limited.
Right, my understanding of this is, and I wouldn't want to take this as gospel, is on twofolds. On directors furloughing themselves, they can only do that if they pay themselves through a PAYE system, so that they're on the PAYE records. If they're paying themselves in other ways, such as dividends or whatever, they can't furlough themselves. As doing essential work, there is some guidance, I think, out there which says that you may do certain small essential administrative tasks, like, as you say, cancelling a bank direct debit mandate or tasks such as that. What I think you may not do is any task that involves in productive capacity of the company. So in other words, you wouldn't be able to work in any either service or manufacturing operation which would actually produce money for that company. But I think essential services are allowed. But what I will do is I do have your name, Rosemary, and I will just check that out for you, as I promised to do last week, and I'm sorry it hasn't yet come through to you.
Okay, Sir Geoffrey, thank you. This is from Chris Davis. Chris is someone we both know. And he's asking about NHS volunteer responders. I have a relative who is on chemotherapy. Can you tell me, please, how one contacts the NHS volunteer responders to help with shopping, etc.? Thank you.
Yes, Chris, I can. You need to contact, and if you've got a piece of paper and pencil handy, or you can put it on a memory of some sort, you need to contact GOODS, GOODS, MAPP, all one word, .org/NHS. But again, I will put that on my website for you.
I think we've talked about this before. What we need to do, Sir Geoffrey, is find a way of getting some briefing notes from you onto
the website,
your Facebook page, and hopefully the Barn Theatre can assist in that area as well, so that people can access this information.
Yep.
Right.
I agree.
This is from Carol Teese, who runs Dutton's Gift Shop in Bourton-on-the-Water. Dear Sir Geoffrey, one of the criteria for receiving the Self-Employed Income Support Scheme is that a business intends to continue trading in the tax year 2021. Could you explain what the thinking is behind this, as the payments will not be made until June and will be to cover the previous 3 months when businesses have had no personal income? I know of several businesses in Bourton-on-the-Water that have already been put up for sale. Does this mean that if they receive this money and then their business sells before the end of the tax year, they will have to repay this money?
Well, this is the first time I've had this specific question put to me, Carol. I think clearly nobody knows what is going to happen in the future and whether it will be possible for each and every business to revive themselves and start trading again once this whole thing is over. But I will ask the question on your behalf. But I think the primary purpose of all this help is obviously to give people enough money to live on, but also to try and shore as many businesses up as possible so that they can be resurrected the moment the government lifts the current lockdown procedures.
Thank you. This is a question from Carol Musgrove in Maisie Hampton. And essentially we're getting questions, not only life-changing questions now about how coronavirus is affecting people, but a number of questions are coming in about what's going to happen post-coronavirus, which I know is something that you're keen to start to focus on, as well as, where are we going with some of these things and some of the I call them advantages of what we're experiencing now with clear skies and clean air and so on. But Carol's question is...
It is natural that people will focus on the future. Will focus, I'm certainly doing this, focusing on how they can improve their business when they are allowed to restart. So that's absolutely natural, and it's natural they should want to ask me questions about it.
Well, Carol works in the NHS at the local hospital. Surely customs from whatever nation and however deeply rooted, if found or thought to be endangering our whole world order and health, should be questioned and the country of origin made accountable and brought to task in the strongest possible ways by all nations. Does our government feel that the pandemic, said to have emanated in China's wet markets or from their laboratories, feel that China should be held accountable and therefore strong steps taken by all nations to bring this about? Does Sir Geoffrey feel that this will ever happen, and if so, how?
Well, we've had this question earlier in the session,
yeah.
and I did say that I think probably because of the number of people in China who have died and because of the damage to their economy, they will themselves want to examine this thoroughly. But I think there will be a lot of international opprobrium as to what's happened in China, and there will be pressure, I am absolutely certain, on China. The difficulty with China is it's so large and so much of a law unto itself. Whether it will take any notice or not, I don't know. But I can imagine in their own self-interest that they wouldn't want this to happen again.
Thank you, Sir Geoffrey. This is from a district councillor, Nikki Ind. I think is based in, represents Tetbury. Good afternoon, Sir Geoffrey. Could I please ask the following question? Our local hospices provide valuable inpatient and home services to the residents of the Cotswolds, supporting the NHS by stopping these patients having to be admitted to hospital and supporting families at the most difficult time. My family are extremely grateful to the support provided to us by Longfield Hospice during my late father's illness. Do you think the government should assist with the funding of these vital services? Their fundraising has been dramatically reduced by the current crisis, threatening services and potentially increasing the chance of increased hospital admissions and additional pressure on the NHS. If you agree, I urge you to please raise this matter with the Secretary of State for Health, Matt Hancock, as a matter of urgency. Many, many thanks, and I look forward to watching the session today.
So, Nikki, another...
Nikki, it's Nikki.
Nikki, that's what I said.
Sorry.
Another really good question, which I would expect nothing less from you. A really good question and a really heartfelt issue. The government is providing £5 million to help mental health charities, and I can see no reason at all why they shouldn't provide some help for hospices. Hospices do provide some of the most heart-rending necessary help of any in the whole of the NHS system. And I will very strongly put your case to see what can be done to help hospices.
Okay, we have got quite a few questions and we've got probably 5 minutes, Sir Geoffrey, so I will go even faster. This is from Derek Nash.
Or ask several questions at once, whichever you prefer.
Okay. Well, you might be able to answer them. I'm not sure I can do that. This is from Derek Nash, an alderman and former district and county councillor. Sir Geoffrey, Easter is fast approaching, and with it the usual migration to the southwest, Peak District, etc. I think you've got a view on that. Will the government please spell out in words of one syllable that travelling to such locations is unnecessary and puts other people at risk? Do you agree that closing hotels, B&Bs, campsites and car parks in such places would be helpful? It would also be helpful if people were told that a Cotswold holiday home is not acceptable as a principal residence and that they should return to their main home without delay. I think that paragraph may be directed in a particular place, but it's mainly about stopping people with Easter coming forward.
Well, Derek, I hope you're keeping well. Second homes and Easter. So I've already made it clear, and we've all the MPs in their conference call with the Chief Constable and others yesterday had a discussion about what is and what is not acceptable in terms of people driving to other destinations. The way it was put to me is that a drive of a mile to walk your dog is acceptable. A drive of 10 miles is not acceptable. So I think that people should be strongly discouraged. In fact, more than they should not do it. The government has said that people should not drive anywhere unless it's absolutely necessary, and I've been through the criteria which are necessary. So the idea of driving any distance to the Cotswolds for Easter or anything else is against the government guidelines. As regards people who are in the Cotswolds in their second homes, it would make no sense whatsoever to ask them to go back. If they're settled in their second home, ask them to go back to where they came from with all the risks that that involves. Having said that, and I made it quite clear last week, one would now, in view of the new government guidelines since I made my remarks on Radio Gloucestershire, it's not acceptable for people to come from elsewhere to make their second home their permanent home during the course of this coronavirus. It's not a necessary journey, and they shouldn't do it.
Okay. I'm just going to take two questions at once at your suggestion. One is from Joan Ann Gardner, which is to do with our readiness for corona preparation and the delay, which you effectively has answered. But I thought I'd mention that fact that we have read your question, Joan, and it has already been answered about our preparedness and the lessons that need to be learnt from countries like Korea and Italy, sadly. So if we could end on this last question. It's not the last question we've got, but it's the last question for today, so we've got plenty for next week. And this is from Stuart Bell, and this is a whole new subject, which is a good way to end. There is a large home educating community in the North Cotswolds. What action can Sir Geoffrey take to ensure that they are treated equally with traditionally educated children with regards to O and A level exams? And will he seek to ensure that the Prime Minister's promises on this area are upheld? And that's from Stuart Bell.
Stuart, I'm not entirely sure what you mean by your question. I understand the concept of home educating. I've met many home educators in the past, and they've had lobbies on Parliament and so on. What I'm not particularly clear is what it is in the parity with regularly educated state and other forms of other education you want parity with. So I think you should email me with that, and then I will take it up with the relevant authorities.
Okay. That's all we've got time for, Sir Geoffrey. The Barn Theatre have given us an hour and a half, and again, I'd like to thank them for the time. And judging by the questions and the responses that you're able to give people, and the way people are using the system to come back and answer ask the same question again, and for clarity and so on, or to pick you up on some of your answers. I hope you find that this process is useful and one that you wish to continue. I know that people I've spoken to are enjoying this fact, and someone said to me yesterday, now I know what my MP looks like. And so do I know what you look like.
I hope you do after all these years, David.
So could I thank you on behalf of all of us for the work you're doing on our behalf. We've given you a mountain of work to go forward and questions to answer. I know that you've made it clear to me that you want to have all these questions sent through to you so you can follow them up, so that next week when we have this session we don't get ourselves asked questions that we haven't been able to answer during the course of the week. So I stand...
So David, I think the really important thing about this process is that, say, every single question will get passed on to the relevant minister, and it does form part of the government's continuing policy making as to how to help the maximum number of people and businesses in this country. So the whole issue that has been raised several times today of limited companies and dividends, I'm sure will be being thought about very carefully by the Chancellor. We will have to see what he comes up with. But many of the problems that have been raised from the first session on self-employed have now been largely dealt with. On the second section on business interruption loans have now been considerably eased. And let's see whether the same thing happens with limited companies and dividends. But can I thank you all very much putting your questions. It's been an enjoyable and very useful sessions. Again, many thanks to all at the Barn Theatre for continuing to do this, but above all, particularly to you, David. I really do think you do a wonderful and professional job. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I had the last word even.
You did.
Thank you.
You did.
Okay. Have a good weekend.
Indeed.